Good afternoon, everybody, on this very sunny afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 8th of June, and welcome to Achates Live for today's session on Leaving a Legacy. I'm Kerry Isles, Senior Consultant at Achates Philanthropy and your host for today's session. It's very lovely to be back with all of you. I used to host these sessions regularly several months ago, but I've been away for a few months on adoption leave. It's been a tiny amount of chat about that on the old YouTube chat.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Oh, excuse me, let me just mute.
Sunny afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 8th of June.
There you go. You can see I've been away for a while. I forgot to mute my YouTube window. That's a good start, isn't it? Still, at least I've got my technical hitch over and done with early on in the afternoon. So these sessions are brought to you by Achates Philanthropy. We are a creative consultancy with a holistic approach to fundraising and strategy development. We take our name from Greek and Roman mythology. Achates was the close friend and loyal advisor to Aeneas. And we like to think our name pretty neatly describes the relationship we offer to the cultural sector. We set up Achates Live to support the sector, bringing fundraisers together to discuss key topics and also to enable you to help each other. At Achates, we always say we don't have all the answers, but what we do have is an overview of the cultural sector, and we really like to use this in a supportive way. Our live stream started as a way for us to support the sector during the first lockdown, and has continued since then, driven by topics that you, the viewers, have requested. So today's session, Leaving a Legacy, is, funnily enough, looking at how to develop legacy giving for your organisation. For me, that's an area that other charities have historically been quite strong on, but a lot of arts and cultural organisations have yet to develop. And I know that Caroline's going to be touching on some of those reasons later on in the session. Today, we have with us two excellent panellists, and the session is going to be led by our very own director, Caroline McCormick. So with us today, we have Mabs Rahman, who is about to be formally development manager at King's Head Theatre. He is joining Medicinema as development manager apparently tomorrow. So we've just got Mabs at the end of his work with King's Head. We also have with us Emma Hazelwood, who is products and propositions manager and gifts in wheels at the National Trust. So two very different perspectives there from those two. Mabs is an innovative legacy marketing and fundraising strategy specialist with 3 years experience in senior fundraising. He believes that there are 3 essential areas of skill within legacy marketing and fundraising strategy, these being data analysis, there we go, meaningful stewardship and emotive copywriting. So in his just about current role at the King's Head Theatre. He's just taking over the role of fundraising manager at Medicinema, where he plans on integrating various fundraising streams to create a cyclical journey for donors. Emma Hazelwood first found a passion for fundraising as an intern in the tiny back room of Town Hall Symphony Hall in Birmingham. 12 years on, she's built an award-winning legacy marketing programme for the University of Birmingham and led the Gifts in Wheels team at the National Trust to significantly grow their legacy pipeline. A firm believer in equal access to the arts and education, Emma enjoys working with like-minded people to find the money to make it happen. I think we could all agree with that as fundraisers, Emma, absolutely. So I'm going to hand you over now to Caroline, who will lead you through the session, and I will see you at the end. So if you've got any questions during the session or things that you'd like to contribute, do drop them into the chat function on the bottom, on the right-hand side of your screen. We love to hear from you. Like I say, we don't have all of the answers. We'd like to hear what you have to say as well. So with that, I will hand you over to the very capable hands of our very own Caroline McCormick.
Oh, thanks, Kerry, and you've set me up there, I think, definitely. First of all, welcome back, Kerry. Really lovely to have you back with us. So proud of you in your 6-month adoption leave, and really amazing what you've been doing there. And a big thank you to Kane, who's been leading these sessions over that period, and we'll be back again with you very soon, I'm sure. And it's really wonderful to have you here with us, Mabs and Emma. Thank you so much. So as Kerrion has said, really what we wanted to think about in this session is the fact that legacies remain a relatively untapped area for much of the cultural sector. And when I met Mabs a few months ago when he started at the King's Head, I was so excited to meet a fundraiser coming into culture who really was an expert in the area. And you can imagine really delighted to meet Emma as well, as someone who started out in the cultural sector, moved into higher education and now mainstream charities / culture in thinking about specialisms in this area. And it's really made me think about why it is that we perhaps haven't concentrated on legacies in such a way in culture to date. Perhaps it's to do with the short-term focus that we have, but also perhaps a continued sense of discussing death as being taboo. And I want to just delve into those ideas a little bit more deeply before we begin. Given this, I'm going to start by outlining our experience of legacy fundraising across the sector. Then I'll go to Mabs to speak as a successful mainstream charity fundraiser, and then to Emma, who is a legacy expert working in an organisation which drives a substantial portion of its income from legacies. And we're really sorry that Liz Hilder of Stage Text is unable to join us today to give us her perspective as well. Best wishes to you, Liz. So, in thinking about this session, I really considered how many of the 500 or so cultural organisations that Achates has worked with over the last 7 years across the UK, and how many of them really have a genuinely active legacy programme and not just perhaps a leaflet that one might find in a foyer. And the honest answer was that I could only really think of a few, and I think that's really surprising. And when I reflected on why that might be, I wondered, please contradict me, tell me in the chat, ask your questions, but I wondered if it's perhaps partly to do with it being a hangover from the way in which voluntary income generation was introduced into our sector, perhaps 25 or so years ago now. And at the time, many of you will have heard me talk about my arrival at the National Theatre as part of a team of development managers who really weren't very welcome at that time, and how the organisation has really changed and evolved to cultural fundraising since. But perhaps it was that real idea that fundraising was a necessary evil that was required because the end of full state funding, whatever that may have meant, had really come about. And that short-term approach was really married to that, perhaps. The idea that this was something we would have to do for a period of time before we reverted back to full state funding, perhaps didn't really encourage us to think about legacies in a constructive way. I'd also suggest that added to that, there's perhaps the history that cultural sector funding has. And as we know, it was only in the 1940s, at the end of the Second World War, that local authorities were allowed, actually given permission to fund cultural organisations. And that first white paper for culture that came from Jenny Lee, the partner of Nye Bevan, who was equally a champion of the NHS and the cultural sector. So that first white paper in the 1960s, when she was the first Minister for Culture, that's when full state funding, as we know it, as we have known it, really came in. So I suppose within that frame of state and local funding, perhaps the fact that also sits alongside that is the fact that culture itself only legally became a charitable object at the end of the 20th century. So that really means that when major arts organisations started to really actively fundraise, they didn't have confidence that audiences would see them as charities. I know that was certainly the case at the National Theatre when I started there. Everything was set up as very transactional because, well, people won't understand that we're charitable. You know, it really will be a change in mindset. So we've got to do it all in terms of exchange. And we certainly perhaps weren't as adept about communicating the value and impact we have in society as we hope we are today. And of course, the narrative at that time was very much focused on the intrinsic value of art and culture. I would say that pendulum has swung, to my mind, a little bit heavily purely towards economic, as opposed to the 8 different types of value that culture can bring. But it was certainly a very different position than the one we have today. So as I've said, given that most fundraising for a long time until relatively recently was very highly transactional, and in many cases, major institutions really have only started fundraising for what we think of as major gifts relatively recently. And the other factor in this, I really wonder, is perhaps the desire for a cost-effective approach. So that desire for everything to pay dividends relatively quickly with that already quite short-term lens perhaps means that it's really only major institutions who've tackled legacies in a substantive way to date. Now, for me, this is deeply ironic because whilst very few organisations that we work with, that we see genuinely really engage with the proper definition of high net worth individuals, really the majority of donors that they are dealing with do have the capacity to some degree to leave major gifts in their terms in their wills. So there's a huge untapped market there that we're really not accessing because we're thinking in that short-term way. So my challenge to all of you today is to think about legacies in a more focused way, even if the results aren't going to be immediate. So just to summarise that thought and put it out there for you, as I was thinking about this session and what I was going to share, I reflected back on the fact that when I got married 6 years ago now, I had to work that out then, 6 years ago, I remade my will. And at that point, I made a number of pledges, which I haven't necessarily told the people who are in that will about, but I've left art and jewellery to family and friends that I would want to perhaps leave a gesture of my love and thanks to them. And I updated that will to leave also charity donations to organisations like DEC, Disaster and Emergencies Commission. But I remember sitting there and thinking, I should be leaving a bequest to an arts organisation, and feeling really saddened that of all the arts organisations I know and love and work with, there isn't one that I felt that, even though I've given donations to, I've got such a relationship with that I'd want to make that kind of pledge. So there's a bit of a challenge out there for you. And I'm sure there are many people out there who feel like me that they would love to be in a position to make that kind of pledge. So, Mabs, can I turn to you in the first instance, please? Perhaps you'd talk through a little bit of your success in mainstream charity sector fundraising for legacies and how you've been trying to translate that to the cultural sector to date.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Caroline, especially for that lovely sort of story. I'm sure DEC are so happy to put you on the pledger pipeline right now. So that's fantastic. So my success, I sort of list you through the implementation of a new legacy strategy at my last focused role in legacy marketing, which was at CPRE, where we increased procured income from 1.2 million to 2.2 million, and that was back off the back of a strategy, a pragmatic strategy that I had implemented to contact solicitors more regularly than what we had been doing. Increasing people to the legacy journey, intenders, pledgers, inquirers by 47%. And all of that stuff is really great for stakeholders. They love to hear about ROI, and ROI is a different topic in legacy marketing about if that actually exists. That's a completely different discussion. But I think something that is really important to talk about, and hopefully I can sort of allude to it in the short time that I have, is how we go about creating that experience for donors. And what it means to be a donor, in Caroline in her position, not telling all the charities that she has put in her will. Why is that? Why is there that kind of disparity between communications? And the first story, sort of anecdote I want to talk about is the first legacy call that I ever had. So I was very green, 24 years old, working for an amazing charity called Brook, an international development charity. And 2 weeks in, I got a call from a supporter who said, "Is this the legacy department?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he was like, "Brilliant. I want to leave a gift in my will to you because I'm going to die soon. So could you please give me some details, more details?" Completely green. I was like, "No, sir, I'm sure you'll live forever." Something like that. And he reassured me in that call and said, "I know my own morality, son, and I know what it implies to leave a gift in the will. And he reassured me so quickly, and that was a great sort of learning tool. And organizations that are starting out in legacies, this is really crucial for you, because your supporters already understand the implications of leaving a gift in the will, that for you to receive that gift, they will have to die. So there's no need to have that sort of condescending tone or being overly nice. I found that once you're able to gauge a supporter, you can even sort of joke around it a little bit. You can have a playful conversation, depending on the supporter, depending on what the conversation is going like. But having that connection only intensifies the sort of feel that they have for you as an organization and personalizes it. And the second kind of anecdote I want to talk about is the meaning of having a gift in the will and what it means to the supporter. So obviously Caroline's giving herself an example. She's left specific legacies to members of her family, her loved ones. And that's what you got to remember. Your charity or charities are left in the will with a loved one in a lot of cases. I know Smee and Ford will have different kind of what sort of data around who leaves a gift and who is bequeathed a legacy, but generally a lot of the time it is with a loved one. And a great example of this is somebody who had left a gift in their will for Jesus Christ, for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And this isn't to show to say that this person was way too religious. In fact, it's showing how much he valued his religion and how important that religion was to him, that he left a lot of his possessions and a massive legacy to the second coming of Jesus Christ without actually having that tangible evidence in front of him. But also in his will, he had left a gift in his will to Christian Aid. So just seeing that he's left a gift in his will to Christian Aid and Jesus Christ, and at that sort of same level, that they both have gifts in their wills. So one thing that I will hopefully discuss as we go on with this session is what it means to be, as a legacy marketing specialist or anybody who is doing legacy marketing, to be a storyteller and to be a memory creator. And hopefully I'll be able to expand on those points a little bit later on.
I was so busy writing that down because I thought it was so beautiful that you caught me on the hop. Thank you so much.
As much as you were, Caroline.
Oh, no. Thank you. Those are really great and inspiring examples, and just really wonderful to hear about how you've been applying that. Emma, might I turn to you, please? I'd love to hear a bit about your experience and how you've really taken an organisation that was already a powerhouse in legacy fundraising to another level.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the conversation. It's great to be here. People look at the National Trust and with a bit of envy, I think, when it comes to legacy fundraising, because we do enjoy a very high level of legacy gifts. It's 10% of our overall income, and it's our second highest net income after membership. But we are reaping the benefits of what we sowed 20 or more years ago, really, in that we took some of our USPs and created a program that went from strength to strength throughout the 1990s. So, I mean, we think about the National Trust, we are forever for everyone. And so when people come to leave a legacy and they're thinking and trying to imagine what that gift is going to do, it's fairly obvious what a legacy to the National Trust can achieve, because we're always going to be here, that the places that are in our care are always going to be in our care. And also the benefit is very wide reaching. We are caring for these places on behalf of the nation. And actually, I think our member base has been one of our best assets. And through the 1990s, we were mailing about 30,000 members each month on a rolling basis to talk to them about legacy giving. And through that time, we added over 100,000 interested parties into our legacy pipeline. So yes, I've come in and I've inherited what was a very well-established program. But unfortunately, it got a little bit neglected. And I think this is sort of a really good example of you see that the legacy income is actually just coming in, and people kind of assume that legacy income just appears and you don't actually have to work for it. And a decision was made to, we can kind of rely on that now. It's just going to tick along, and of course it didn't really tick along. So lots of other charities have come into the marketplace, and if we're not careful at the National Trust, we're going to start having our legacy income sort of eaten away at by new charities. And do you know what? There's loads to go around. We're about to have this huge transfer of wealth over the next 20, 25 years, so that there's plenty to go around. And what I was able to do coming into the National Trust is to start generating that pipeline again. So a lot of our pipeline had gone quite cold. So we just started to integrate all of our legacy fundraising into a multi-channel campaign. So what we were really good at, taking what we were really good at in the 90s, but leaving some of those more traditional fundraising methods behind. It's quite funny looking back at some of the direct mails that they're very overtly asking people to leave a gift in their will, which I think these days we talk a lot more about consideration, and we sort of ask without really asking. So putting a more of a modern day tone on that campaign. But we started to buy press ads again. We started to use our own channels again, because we just weren't using this fantastic resource that we had with our member base. And so by utilising all of those USPs, which I think are applicable to most arts organisations and cultural organisations, because of the way we function with these lovely warm databases full of ticket buyers and donors and members. But actually, we hadn't been talking to those people for a long time about legacies. So it was just really great to see that they were still really engaged with it. And we were generating 8,000 click-throughs to our website every Free Wills Month, when we put a message into our member e-news about the fact that it's Free Wills Month. So the interest was absolutely still there, and I just had an opportunity to come in and start talking about it a bit more.
Well, that's very generous, Emma. It's only a good fundraiser that's so modest in my eyes. I think what's really interesting there is hearing you talk about how perhaps, if you'll excuse me putting words in your mouth, there was a tiny bit of complacency that had creeped in there, and how you'd really seen that the need to continually invest in that membership and to keep communicating with them really was what made the difference. I'd love just to ask you, in that process, because you were particularly focusing on this, and I don't know if you were during COVID, Mabs, but how you managed that communication during COVID, and whether that was something that, obviously changed the tone and the reflection of the way you were expressing things.
Sure, yeah. I during COVID, because when I arrived at CPRE, we had done no legacy marketing ever. So everything was new. Everything was building the strategy, building the foundation. I took a strategic view that because we had local network groups, which I did a lot of sort of workshops with for local fundraising, I took a strategic view that we would stop our legacy marketing campaigns at the same time. So for the first 4 or 5 months of legacy giving, and actually in hindsight, that was probably the wrong thing to do. Could have softened the tone and sent out those same campaigns through. What had happened also at the beginning of the pandemic was we had a legacy event, first one of our in our existence. And it was going to be a great day. Dwayne Fields, Arctic Explorer, was coming to talk about green spaces and what it meant to mental health. We had 42 guests. We already made £1,010 in pre-event donations. Everything was going to go great. And COVID put a halt to all of that. So engaging with supporters, and I firmly believe that in the UK, our culture is always very much to be quite intimate in the donor experience. So I individually sent a video message to everybody who was going to that event. So to Sally, to James, to Paul, to Simon, to everybody. Everything that I knew about them, I tried to add into those video messages that I sent through. What off the back of that, what had happened was that we were able to engage with these supporters in a more meaningful way. Constant communication, phone calls every 3 months, just to catch up with them, make sure that they weren't lonely, make sure that they had all the things that they needed, to be that voice of sanity during that period. Because as we all sort of remember, went sort of crazy on Zoom calls and quizzes and all of that sort of stuff. But it was really about engaging and building that goodwill with people who might not have really heard about legacies before. And that built a really great platform to tell very emotive stories about people, gaining stories as well at the same time about why people had chosen CPRE. The one thing that you have to understand about CPRE is that a lot of our supporters from a focus group in 2016 had stated that what would happen if CPRE didn't exist. They posed that question to us. They didn't understand the full necessity of CPRE as an organization. So that was one of my first things to mitigate and to showcase what we had achieved throughout our 5 years that we had been around. So a big part of the pandemic was about showcasing that and creating that personalized story and filling out, the sort of stuff that we all do, like me and Emma, building out those stewardship journeys, understanding where to integrate different sort of fundraising streams, where that journey intersects, all these types of stuff. But in hindsight, I wish I would have taken a more direct approach during the beginning of the pandemic, because a lot of smaller charities did quite well, especially from free gifts, from free will services. How tangible that was, that's a different discussion as well. But that was sort of the approach I took at the time.
Thanks, Mav. I think that's very honest of you, but I think completely understandable that you would have taken that approach. And I think what's really nice is just hearing about consolidating those relationships and how you took that to another level. It's really impressive. Emma, what about from your perspective? Because COVID did cast a very different light on communications for a time. How did you handle it?
Yeah, interestingly, we did pretty much the opposite to Mav's. We had, obviously, our members were being looked after with member engagement communication. So we were, remaining in contact with people, even though they couldn't come and visit us, which for both for us and them was a really big thing, that our houses in particular were closed, and for parts of the year all of our places were entirely closed. So our member engagement team really upped their game and came up with this wonderful plan of engagement communications that went out. And 2/3 of our legacy pledges are members, so they will have received those. But in terms of, we did a lot more in terms of online will writing and digital acquisition, because we could do those things for very little cost in what was actually a time at the National Trust of spending freeze because of the severe financial impact that it had had. So not only did we have this sort of heightened awareness of our mortality coming from COVID, but also just a limit on how much we could spend to talk about gifts and wills. And I really wish we'd been able to call our supporters for a lovely conversation, because I think that would have just been brilliant. And that's where you get the best conversations. It is on the telephone, and I would highly endorse, if you can ever do telephone campaigns, it's absolutely brilliant for legacies. We had a good level of success with it at the University of Birmingham, where I worked previously. But we actually launched an online will writing product in May last year. So we'd got, at the time the pandemic hit, we were in the final stages of closing this contract. And even though we had the spending freeze, we decided that it was really important that we provided our members with a way that they could write their wills safely at home. And also we understood that legacy income for us is really important, that we provide our members with a way to pledge, even when they can't go and visit a face-to-face solicitor. And it's brought in 12 times what we've paid for it in future income over the last year. And then that should hopefully only increase once we can actually start marketing this opportunity a bit more widely. We did a little bit of paid social and used our own channels to talk about it. But I think, so Free Wills Month, they continued through 2020. And they did get a little bit of negative media in March 2020, when everything was really quite close to the bone. But they just stuck with it. And I think they did the right thing, because people then have the opportunity to pledge if they want to. And they were very firm about the rationale for continuing. So I don't think we should shy away from talking about legacies because it's about death. In fact, there was a chart published by Fairwill, another online will writing provider, that showed this enormous spike in people going and using their online will writing platform in March, just when lockdown hit. It was the day of lockdown, and they show this absolutely ginormous spike because people were finding it really relevant. We were faced with our own mortality and suddenly realized that what happens to our loved ones if something were to happen to me.
Absolutely, rings so true, Emma. And I was talking about how I made that will when I got married. It's these key moments, and this was such a universal moment where we were all contemplating on mortality and actually being very realistic about it. So yeah, no, makes complete sense. What's so interesting is that at that moment, you and the National Trust had really taken that long-term perspective. You weren't reduced to that very short-termism of we've only got limited resources, where can we put them? But what both of you talked about, which I think is so interesting, is about communicating the value of the work that you do as charities. And it's something we've talked about in these sessions a tremendous amount, how during COVID we've moved from a relationship with our audiences that has been highly transactional and marketing led into ones where we've really told our stories in a more constructive way and built a stronger relationship. And for me, that really does create a really interesting platform for the cultural sector to be thinking about legacy, relationships at this time. But I'd love to ask both of you, of people who've been very much in the cultural sector, standing slightly outside it at the present time, what do you think the potential is for the cultural sector in terms of fundraising? Do you think it's something, if you were coming into those roles, you really be putting energy behind? Mabs, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much because so much potential, just because in the general sort of fundraising sector, there might not be that ability to tell as emotive stories, especially if you're a small charity that hasn't worked to cultivate those stories. But from my perspective, working at the King's Head Theatre, I saw so much, and that just leads me back to what I sort of talked about earlier about being a storyteller and being a memory creator. I think the story of the King's Head Theatre that was created in the 1970s and became a sanctuary for the LGBTQIA+ community, and how that has still led on to this day, is such an emotive story to tell. And when you're able to engage with a supporter and tell the stories of the people who have been there and who have attended plays or have left donations, you're able to say that how beneficial that has been to creating our theatre and continuing it, especially during the pandemic, and telling them that safeguarding the future is only available, is only able to be to be created with you as our community, is such a powerful message. And I know different theatres and different art organisations have that ability to tell that story. And I think it's fantastic. And I think before I left, I created a legacy campaign. I didn't push it out because I wanted it to be something that the audience didn't feel was shoehorned in between different productions. I wanted it to feel like it was something important on its own. So to find that sort of gap in the communication, in the communication between audiences. But I also think that being a memory creator is really important as well. During events, legacy events throughout my career, and doing, as Emma sort of alluded to as well, the power of the phone call with legacy supporters, creating that memory, having that lasting impact where they say, oh, I had this amazing call last week, or I went to an amazing event a month ago. Remembering that can be just as powerful, because you're constantly in the head of the supporter now. That's where your ad can run forever as an organization. And when you have centralized space, like a lot of arts cultural organizations have, it's a perfect way of inviting legacy supporters to come and enjoy your space, just like you would if it was, you know, a lunch with the artistic director or whatever is available on the membership and patrons programs that other organizations have. If you're able to utilize your space and create a memory that is forever lasting, you run that, your ad or your legacy pitch, in the head of the supporter for a long time, and it plays into that storytelling as well. So they're not antithetical to each other, but they counter, sort of contrast each other perfectly. So those are sort of tools that you should look at with your organization going forward. How can you tell that story? Can we create a memorable experience, and fitting that into your stewardship journey going forward?
I love that, Mabs, the idea that that experience is an ad that can roll in their head forever. And, you know, I always think whenever you're asking somebody for a gift, you really want that person to go home and say, guess what happened today? It should be that really positive experience, and there's no reason why legacy should be any different. Emma, I'd love your perspective on this.
Yeah, two things come to mind, really building on what Mab said about community. Because whether or not we have a physical space, I think arts and cultural organisations, we're at the heart of a community. And if we can harness that community by inviting them to come along with us, rather than simply being on a periphery where they come in and use what we've got, if you can engage your community, then they will absolutely want to support you to succeed, because you're all in it together. So there's absolutely a future to fundraise from that community. And what Mab said that reminded me of this is that memory thing. That when we make our will, we use the same part of our brain that we use to reminisce, which is why legacy fundraising in higher education is brilliant, because we all look back on our university days with rose-tinted spectacles, don't we? And if you have a relationship with an arts venue or organisation, you know, one that you go back to time and time and again, you are going to naturally think about those times when you come to write your will. And some research has shown that on average, we put 3 charitable gifts into our will, and one of those gifts will be for us. So 2 will be altruistic. It's we give it because the charity needs the money, but 1 gift will be, it's a gift that we want to give because it's something that we enjoy. So you don't have to be a medical charity. You don't have to you know, be a development charity to really pull at people's heartstrings, because their own experiences will do that for you.
That's super, Emma. Thank you for articulating that so clearly. And I think you've just captured for me what was slightly missing. There's lots of experiences, but not one overriding connection. So I look forward to reaching that point with an arts organisation very soon. I've no doubt that the 2 of you will have inspired all our listeners today to really get going with legacy fundraising. But I imagine that because we've got lots of fundraisers in our community, one of the challenges that they're going to have is persuading their senior managers to really enable them to spend time on this, when perhaps that short-termism is going to be even more pressing in light of the COVID pandemic. Mabs, what would you say to our community out there in terms of how they might go about persuading their senior managers to allow them to spend time on this type of fundraising?
Sure. I was so lucky to have an amazing ED who, you know, was bought into fundraising, but I know a lot of people will have that sort of struggle going forward. Hi, Fiona, if you're watching. So I think that pandemic is almost a great precursor to showing the importance of legacy giving. Sort of the numbers, that statistics that Emma alluded to with Farewell, Legacy Foresight have also brought out numbers as well regarding these things, and they're all available at their request. Putting forward this kind of idea that safeguarding the future is really important, and the kind of idea of forecasting and creating these sustainable models going forward, which is more business orientated then, rather than just focusing on the initial income that is coming in. There will always be a fight for how much money is invested into your programs, as I'm sure Emma sort of realizes as well with her work that she's done, that you're often seen as a fundraising discipline that doesn't do much. You sort of send out a questionnaire and they fill it out, and then you get the money 10 years later and you haven't really done anything about it. But that's completely not the case, because we're providing those stewardship journeys and we're having that intimate conversation. And a lot of the time, the people who have the best experiences of the charity are coming directly through the legacy team, because we're cultivating those relationships. And that's what we're really doing as legacy fundraisers. We're maintaining the relationships, and maybe it can be beneficial for major donors, maybe it can be beneficial for individual giving, but that's what we are. We're the linchpin of a fundraising program. And if you have a good legacy program and everyone is bought in, from stakeholders to your receptionist, and everybody's working along the same way, which happened at the Brook and happened at CPRE, you can really create something amazing. So I don't think it's a hard sell, but it will always be a sort of difficult conversation to have in terms of expenditure. But yeah, I think most organizations will understand the longevity of it in creating that sustainable business model going forward.
Thanks, Mabs. And I love that vision of a culture of fundraising in an organisation that you've laid out there, where everybody's part of that fundraising team. Emma, any advice from you on this?
Yeah, I think we struggle to get the buy-in because we struggle to demonstrate ROI for legacies. And that really is, if you're going to work in legacy fundraising, you have to be a little bit comfortable with fudgy numbers, because there's no definite bottom line to this. And that needs to be the honest narrative to senior management, that there has to be a degree of faith, a long-term commitment before you're going to see any return. And so there's no point starting it and turning back after year 2 because you're not seeing the income. This is a long game. It's 10, 15, maybe 20 years before you're going to start to see a really nice, regular legacy income coming out of it. You'll get a few windfalls along the way, but that narrative needs to be sold to senior management so that there isn't a U-turn on all of your hard work after a few years because they're not seeing the money coming in. And the fact is that a lot of the time we're working with averages. You can just, if you don't, you can just use averages and fudge the numbers and give a sense of what the ROI might be. I think at the National Trust, if you take our in-year legacy income against our in-year legacy spend, it's something like 60-to-1 return on investment, which blows all other fundraising out of the water, probably blows all of other income streams, retail, commercial, whatever, out of the water. And you can start by building it for free. So you can even say this is only going to take, in year 1, it's only going to take time. And, let me show you how many hand raises we can get. So those are the solid numbers that you can start then pulling in, is actually showing how many people have highlighted that they're interested in it, how many people have requested a guide, have visited your webpage, or, and that's when you can start to show and tell that more positive story to say, this is just the beginning. And in 15 years time, the average gift here could be £54,000 per person. And that equates to, X many million pounds of income in 2040.
That sounds like really great advice, Emma, to play the slightly long game and just to keep expectations measured. I think that's really great. And that sounds like something really manageable that I'm sure lots of our listeners could sell internally. Kerry-Ann, I think we've got quite a lot of questions coming in through the chat. Have you got anything you wanted to put to Mabs and Emma?
Yes, so we've had, there's been a lot of conversation on the chat. It's more been organised. There's a number of organisations that are looking at developing their legacy giving at the moment that don't have that at present. So that's quite interesting, I think, in terms of the way that the sector is moving, and actually more and more people starting to look at this type of giving. There's been a lot of interest around Mabs's concept of memory creation. And I think particularly, again, what's been interesting, I think, just reflecting back on some of our previous sessions and thinking about, you know, all of those conversations we've had previously around the personal relationships, the stewardship, the community, and how close you can draw that community, and then the way that you're communicating, I think absolutely run across all the strands that we've talked about so far. So we have a question from Liz Hughes at Cambridge Junction. She has asked, she says, we currently have pieces of work in development that reflect on death. Would you veer away from or towards connecting a new legacy programme with work that deals with issues of mortality? I think that's a really interesting question and a really tricky one. Who dares to come at that first? Mabs, would you like to give us some reflections on that one? It's a really tricky one.
Well, thanks so much, Liz, for the hardest question in the world. No, so could you go through that question again, because it is connected by two things. So I just want to
absolutely, it's quite a thorny one. So she says, we currently have pieces of work in development that reflect on death. Would you veer away from or towards connecting a new legacy programme with work that deals with issues of mortality? So I think what she's asking there is particularly, is it wise or unwise, in your opinion, to think about creating a legacy scheme and using those pieces of work as the driver to launch that scheme?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. If the organisation's sort of programs are dealing with death, then it's a natural kind of fit to talk about both of those things together. I think it goes back to the point about internal buy-in a lot as well, because if you're getting your program director or whoever's creating these programs to sort of buy in and say, yes, we want to go on to that path, then it can be a seamless fit and a sort of great synergy between the different departments in the organisation. I'd have to know more about the organisation to make a definitive one, but just from what Liz has sort of said, I wouldn't necessarily veer away from it, but it does require a lot of internal buy-in, I think, and a programme that isn't too insensitive to what you do as an organisation and seeming not like vultures, but being insensitive in a way. But there is always a balance to match with that, and we've all sort of been through it with the pandemic and the approaches that we've taken to legacy giving, so it can be done. So it's an interesting one to sort of think about. I am on LinkedIn, Liz, so if you want to connect with me, that'd be cool.
Thank you for that, Mabs. And yeah, Liz May, we've got another question coming from Liz shortly, actually. But Emma, what's your perspective on the hardest question in the world, as Mabs called it?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mabs, for giving me 2 minutes to think about what I was going to say in response to that. I think so. There have been some successful campaigns that have chosen to go a bit more close to the bone on death, and they have been successful. Something you might want to have a look at, Liz, is Remember a Charity, past Remember a Charity campaigns. I think one of them early on might have had a play on the word dying. I can't quite think. If I find these examples, I will post them on my LinkedIn as well, so people can see. But I think in the arts and culture sector, we are that little bit more removed from mortality. We're not a hospice or a hospital. So I think there's a little bit more permission there, and also just the nature of how we explore the topic of death through our medium means it might be slightly, less jarring, and because it's got that it's less tangible in how we're talking about death. But my question would be, what is the tone of the piece of work? Is it putting death forward in a positive way? Is there a link to how we live on beyond death, or a link to what legacy we want to leave behind? Or is it very much around, death as sort of being an unknown or a finality, or, it really depends the tone of the piece of work as to whether you might choose to link a legacy in there. And I also think that you could do something really amazing with this, but don't feel that this is your only opportunity, because loads of other organizations, what I've been saying all through my career, legacies are not about death, because lots of people get worried about talking about death, and my point is we don't have to, because we're actually talking about giving, not talking about death. So if you're worried about it, then I would just say leave it alone and choose another way to position your legacy marketing instead.
Great, thank you very much both. I think, yeah, I have to admit, I'm extremely glad I didn't have to answer that question this afternoon. I think it's an incredibly difficult one, and I can see exactly why Liz wanted some external opinions on that one. We do have one more question, which has also come in from Liz. It's a shorter one, so don't be too worried, both of you. So the question is, do people register their pledges with you, or do you find out about them during probate? Emma, how does that work for you?
So there is a piece of research on this from Legacy Foresight that shows only 1 in 4 people will tell you about their gift, which is also really nice for that fudging the figures, because you can show that for every person that tells you about it, there are probably 3 other people who haven't. And yeah, at the National Trust, I think what we expect in higher education and the arts, where we have databases of people, we're more likely to know if the legacy comes in, we're more likely to know the person. We may not know that they pledged, but we're more likely to actually have a record of them on the database because of how we work. And at the National Trust, it's something like 40% of our legacies are completely unknown to us. We don't have a current record for that person on the database.
Great, thank you, Emma. That is interesting. And Mabs, what's your experience of that been?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because I feel like it always depends on where you are with a legacy program or a legacy strategy. Emma sort of talked about it before, that her organization takes a less a sort of more nuanced approach. Instead of directly asking, oh, are you leaving a residuary legacy or a pecuniary legacy or a specific legacy? But I think the way we've sort of seen how pipelines have been created from the past, in the 90s and the early 2000s, was these questions were being asked when we were creating these pipelines. So if you are going out and you're looking to find supporters and trying to find those figures, to find those averages, I think it's a really good question to ask. You might get a lot of kickback from supporters who say, oh, well, this has nothing to do with you. But that's absolutely fine, because it's just a question at the end of the day. So if you really want to build your pipeline and find out what those averages are, and sort of talking about with the figures being fudged, but those averages can be very beneficial to stakeholders. And that's another way of sort of building trust within the organization. So I might, if you're at the beginning, I would personally recommend asking as much as you can. A free question sort of strategy. Are you leaving gift in the world? 4 different options, maybe 5, with a hard yes and a hard no attached to it. A specific question about what type of legacy, residuary, pecuniary, specific, and then asking them for more details in a sort of a text box, maybe. If you're doing a survey, if you're doing any kind of engagement campaign that sort of deals with these elements. But from my personal point of view, if you're starting, you should ask those questions.
And Kerry, and I was just going to add one point to that, if I may, which I won't name the client, but a client that Kane and I have been working with quite recently on a capital project in an area where there are people who are perhaps asset rich rather than cash rich. We have, as part of that capital project, proposed an element where they might have a small aspect of the building named after them if they declare their pledge, and they would be celebrated during their lifetime as well. And we're really excited about that, to see whether it would start to translate into pledges at this organisation that perhaps hasn't really invested in legacy fundraising in the past, but we think has a really great potential for, whether they'll start to be realised. So I think really picking up on what Mabs and Emma have said, we have lots of assets in the arts and cultural sector that we can really be deploying. So trying to think about those in a creative way, I think.
great. Thank you very much, Caroline. While that conversation was happening, Kane pointed out to me that we do have one more question from Charlotte at the Royal Court. I'm not going to post that question here because we are out of time, but Charlotte, if you would like to connect with Mabs or Emma over LinkedIn, then please do that. It's a really great question. I'm really sorry we haven't had time to come to that today. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Mabs Rahman and to Emma Hazelwood for their time this afternoon and their incredibly interesting and valuable insights. I've certainly learned something about legacy giving this afternoon, so thank you so much. Thank you as ever to our director, Caroline McCormick, and thank you to all the viewers and to the interesting insights that you've been discussing on the chat this afternoon. So just to let you know, obviously we are Achates Philanthropy. We have a number of services that we can offer to support you with your organisational development and with your fundraising practices. So we offer a range of services. Do hop over to our website at www.achates.org.uk to see a full range of services, but that ranges from major fundraising feasibility studies, fundraising strategies. We do a huge amount of capital fundraising, so if anyone's looking at capital campaigns, we can help you with those. Trust and foundations fundraising including bid writing and other elements of audience and organisational development.
And even legacies.
And even legacies. Thank you, Caroline. So our next session will be in July. Caroline, what date have we got slated for that one? I haven't written it down on my notes.
So the date of the July session will be, she says, frantically flicking through her diary, Tuesday the 13th of July at 2 p.m. For our next session.
Lovely, thank you so much. That's the one little detail that I did not have. That session will be led by me and our other senior associate, the lovely Helen Gaffney, and we will be discussing ethical fundraising. So that's we've been talking about that. It's a particularly interesting and thorny issue. So until then, thank you very much all for your time this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you